David stood in the middle of the courtroom, his heart pounding like a drum. The room was quiet except for the sound of papers being shuffled and the occasional cough from the people sitting in the gallery. His hands were clasped tightly together, but his eyes kept darting down to the medal pinned on his chest. It was small, shiny, and heavy, both in weight and meaning. For years, it had been a symbol of everything he had worked for: his courage, his sacrifices, and his loyalty to his country. But today it felt more like a spotlight, drawing everyone's attention to him in a way that made his skin crawl. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense expression, leaned forward slightly in her chair. Her voice broke through the silence like a whip crack. "Remove your medal before you testify," she said firmly, her tone leaving no room for argument. David froze, his fingers instinctively brushing against the cold metal. He hesitated, unsure if he had heard her correctly. The medal wasn't just an accessory, it was part of who he was, or at least who he used to be. Removing it felt like stripping away a piece of his identity, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. The seconds ticked by as David wrestled with the command. He glanced around the room, hoping someone might object or tell him this wasn't necessary. But no one spoke up. The lawyers sat quietly, their pens poised over legal pads. The jury watched him with blank expressions, waiting to see what he would do. Even the spectators seemed to hold their breath, their eyes fixed on him. Finally, with a deep sigh, David reached up and unclasped the medal. As it slipped off his chest, he felt a strange emptiness, as though he'd lost something far greater than a piece of metal. He handed it over to the bailiff, who placed it carefully on the judge's desk. Without the medal, David suddenly felt lighter, but not in a good way. Instead of relief, he felt naked, like he'd been stripped of armor he didn't even realize he was wearing. The questions started almost immediately, coming fast and relentless. At first, David answered confidently, his voice steady as he recounted events from his past. He described missions, decisions, and moments of triumph, speaking with the authority of someone who had lived through those experiences. But as the questioning continued, something began to shift. The opposing lawyer, a tall man with a sly smile, began to press harder, poking holes in David's answers and twisting his words, until they sounded unfamiliar even to him. David tried to stay calm, reminding himself that he knew the truth. But without the medal to anchor him, doubt began to creep in. Was he remembering things correctly? Had he made mistakes he hadn't acknowledged at the time? The more he spoke, the more uncertain he became. His sentences grew shorter, his tone less sure. Sweat trickled down his forehead and he wiped it away with the back of his hand, trying to focus. Yet every time he looked toward the judge's desk, where the medal lay gleaming under the bright lights, he felt its absence like a physical ache. The tension in the room grew thicker with each passing minute. Some of the jurors exchanged skeptical glances while others scribbled notes furiously. One woman raised an eyebrow as David stumbled over a particularly difficult question, her expression unreadable. Even the spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that something significant was unfolding before them. David could feel their eyes on him, judging him, dissecting every word he said. Without the medal to remind them of his achievements, he wondered if they saw him differently now, as someone less honorable, less trustworthy. As the hours dragged on, David found himself struggling to keep up. The opposing lawyer circled him, like a predator, asking pointed questions designed to trip him up. "Isn't it true," the lawyer said at one point, leaning casually against the railing, "that during this mission, you ignored protocol because it was inconvenient?" David opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. Protocol? Yes, there had been rules, but weren't there always exceptions in the heat of the moment? Before the medal was removed, he would have defended his actions without hesitation. Now he faltered, unsure how to explain himself without sounding defensive or evasive. By the time the session ended for the day, David felt drained, both physically and emotionally. He walked out of the courtroom with his head bowed, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Reporters swarmed outside, shouting questions and shoving microphones in his face, but he pushed past them, desperate to escape. Back in his car, he sat silently, for a long time, staring at the steering wheel. The day's events replayed in his mind like a broken record, each moment chipping away at his confidence. He couldn't shake the feeling that removing the medal had changed something fundamental, not just in how others saw him, but in how he saw himself. That night, lying awake in bed, David thought about the medal sitting on the judge's desk. It represented so much more than a single achievement. It embodied his entire career, his legacy. Without it, he felt untethered, adrift in a sea of uncertainty. What scared him most wasn't the possibility of losing the case. It was the fear that he might lose himself in the process. The next morning, David woke up feeling like he hadn't slept at all. His body was heavy, his mind foggy, and the events of the previous day weighed on him like a storm cloud. He dragged himself out of bed and into the shower, letting the water run over his face in an attempt to clear his thoughts. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't stop replaying the courtroom scene in his head. The judge's command echoed in his ears. "Remove your medal before you testify." Those words had felt like a punch to the gut, and now, without the medal to shield him, David felt raw and exposed. He dressed quickly, choosing a plain shirt and jeans instead of the suit he'd worn the day before. Somehow, dressing casually made him feel less conspicuous, as though blending into the crowd might protect him from further scrutiny. As he drove to the courthouse, his hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. The streets were busy with commuters rushing to work, but David felt disconnected from the world around him. His focus was entirely on what awaited him inside those imposing double doors: the lawyers, the jury, and most importantly, the absence of the medal that had once defined him. When David arrived, the courtroom wasn't quite as full as it had been the day before. Some spectators had lost interest while others were running late. Still, the atmosphere was tense, charged with anticipation. David took his seat at the witness stand, avoiding eye contact with anyone. He noticed the medal, still sitting on the judge's desk, gleaming under the harsh lights. It seemed to mock him, a silent reminder of everything he had lost. Not just his confidence, but perhaps even his career. The questioning resumed, and this time, the opposing lawyer came prepared. He began by revisiting some of the points David had struggled with the day before, pressing harder and digging deeper. "You mentioned yesterday that you followed standard procedures during this mission," the lawyer said, flipping through a stack of papers. "But according to these reports," he held up a document for emphasis, "there were several deviations from protocol. Care to explain?" David swallowed hard, his throat dry. He remembered the mission well. It had been chaotic, unpredictable, and dangerous. In the heat of the moment, decisions had to be made quickly, often without time to consult manuals or guidelines. "I did what I thought was best," David replied, his voice quieter than he intended. "We were under pressure, and lives were at stake." The lawyer raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "So you admit that you didn't follow protocol?" he pressed. David hesitated, unsure how to respond. Admitting to breaking rules sounded damning, but denying it would make him seem dishonest. "I adapted," he finally said, choosing his words carefully. Sometimes sticking strictly to protocol isn't practical. The lawyer smirked, sensing weakness. "Adapted or ignored?" he shot back, leaning forward slightly. The jury leaned in too, their expressions unreadable. David felt sweat trickling down his back, his nerves fraying with each passing second. Without the medal to bolster his authority, his answers felt hollow, lacking conviction. Even the judge, who had remained impassive throughout the proceedings, seemed to regard him with a hint of skepticism. David clenched his fists under the table, trying to steady himself, but the damage was already done. As the morning wore on, the questions grew more aggressive. The lawyer produced another document, a report alleging misconduct during one of David's earlier missions. Until now, these accusations had remained buried, dismissed as baseless rumors. But here they were, laid out in black and white for everyone to see. David's stomach churned as the lawyer read excerpts aloud, painting a picture of negligence and poor judgment. Is it true, the lawyer asked, his tone dripping with accusation, that civilians were put at risk because of your actions? David's heart sank. He remembered the incident vividly. It had been a high-pressure situation, and while mistakes were made, he had acted in good faith. At the time, his superiors had reviewed the case and concluded that his decisions, though imperfect, were justified, given the circumstances. Now, however, those same decisions were being twisted into evidence of incompetence. David opened his mouth to defend himself, but the words caught in his throat. How could he explain the complexity of the situation in a way that sounded convincing? Without the weight of his medal to lend credibility to his words, he doubted anyone would believe him. The courtroom fell silent as David struggled to find his voice. The jury members exchanged uneasy glances, whispering to one another behind their hands. Some of the spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats while others leaned forward, eager to hear his response. Finally, David managed to speak, though his voice trembled. Yes, there were risks, he admitted, but I made the best decision I could with the information I had at the time. No one could have predicted what happened. The lawyer didn't look satisfied. Predictions aside, he countered, the fact remains that your choices led to unnecessary danger. Isn't that correct? David wanted to argue, to explain that leadership often required making tough calls under impossible conditions. But the words felt futile, drowned out by the lawyer's relentless attacks. Each question chipped away at his composure, leaving him feeling smaller and more vulnerable with every passing minute. By lunchtime, David was exhausted. The break offered little relief. Instead of eating, he paced nervously outside the courthouse, replaying the morning's events in his mind. Strangers walked past him, oblivious to his turmoil, while reporters lingered nearby, hoping to catch a quote or reaction. David avoided them, keeping his head down and his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He wished he could turn back time, undo the judge's command to remove the medal. Maybe then he wouldn't feel so defenseless. When he returned to the courtroom, after lunch, the mood had shifted. The opposing lawyer seemed emboldened, his confidence growing with each successful jab at David's testimony. Even David's own lawyer appeared frustrated, shooting him sympathetic glances when the other side wasn't looking. David knew he needed to regain control of the narrative, to remind everyone why he had earned that medal in the first place. But without it physically present, symbolizing his achievements, he felt like he was fighting an uphill battle. As the afternoon dragged on, David found himself retreating further into his shell. His answers became shorter, his demeanor more withdrawn. The opposing lawyer seized on this, portraying David's silence as evidence of guilt or hesitation. By the time the session ended for the day, David felt utterly defeated. Walking out of the courtroom, he kept his eyes fixed on the floor, unwilling to meet anyone's gaze. Reporters shouted questions, but he ignored them, hurrying to his car as quickly as possible. Back home, David collapsed onto the couch, staring blankly at the wall. The day's events replayed in his mind like a bad dream, each moment more painful than the last. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that this trial might not end in his favor. Worse still, he realized that even if he somehow managed to salvage his reputation, nothing would ever be the same again. Without the medal to anchor him, he felt like a ship adrift, lost in uncharted waters. The days that followed were a blur for David. Each morning he woke up with the same heavy feeling in his chest, as though a weight had settled there and refused to budge. He went through the motions of getting ready, showering, dressing, eating, but everything felt robotic, mechanical. His mind was stuck on replay, cycling through the courtroom scenes over and over again. The questions, the accusations, the skeptical looks from the jury. It all haunted him. And then there was the medal, or rather, the absence of it. Every time he thought about it sitting on the judge's desk, gleaming under the lights, he felt a pang of loss so sharp it almost made him physically sick. By the third day of testimony, David knew he couldn't keep going like this. He needed to find some way to regain control, to remind everyone, not just the jury, but himself, that he wasn't the incompetent man the opposing lawyer was trying to paint him as. But how? Without the medal, without the visual proof of his Years of service and sacrifice, he felt like he was fighting blindfolded. The opposing lawyer seemed to sense his desperation, pressing even harder than before. "Let's talk about your decision-making process," the lawyer said one morning, his tone casual but cutting. "You've admitted to deviating from protocol multiple times. Can you explain why we should trust your judgment?" David clenched his jaw, anger bubbling beneath the surface. He wanted to lash out, to tell the lawyer that leadership wasn't about following rules blindly. It was about making tough calls when lives were at stake. But he bit back the words, knowing they would only make him sound defensive. Instead, he took a deep breath and tried to answer calmly. "I've always done what I believed was right," he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. Sometimes that meant bending the rules to protect people. It sounded weak, even, to his own ears. The lawyer smirked, clearly satisfied with the response, or lack thereof. As the questioning continued, David began to notice something unsettling. The jury didn't seem to be on his side anymore. At first, their expressions had been neutral, open to hearing both sides of the story. Now, though, they looked skeptical, their faces clouded with doubt. One juror, a middle-aged woman with glasses, scribbled furiously on her notepad every time David stumbled over an answer. Another, a younger man with a stern expression, barely glanced at him at all, focusing instead on the documents presented by the opposing lawyer. David could feel their trust slipping away piece by piece, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Outside the courtroom, things weren't much better. Reporters still swarmed him whenever he stepped outside, shouting questions and shoving microphones in his face. "Mr. Carter, is it true you ignored warnings during the mission?" one asked, practically yelling over the others. "Do you regret your actions?" another chimed in. David kept his head down, pushing past them without saying a word. He knew answering wouldn't help. Anything he said would likely be twisted into a headline designed to sell papers. Still, the constant barrage of questions wore him down, chipping away at what little confidence he had left. At home, David found no peace either. Friends who had once praised him for his bravery stopped calling. Colleagues distanced themselves, afraid of being associated with someone whose reputation was crumbling. Even his family struggled to look him in the eye. His wife, Sarah, tried to be supportive, but her silence spoke volumes. She'd sit across from him at dinner, picking at her food while avoiding his gaze. Their conversations were brief and strained, filled with awkward pauses and unspoken worries. David hated seeing the disappointment in her eyes, knowing he was the cause of it. One evening, after another grueling day in court, David sat alone in his study, staring at the wall. The room was quiet, except for the ticking of the clock, each second dragging by like an eternity. He thought about the medal, again, wondering if things would have turned out differently if he'd been allowed to wear it. Would the jury have trusted him more? Would the reporters have backed off? Or was this inevitable, a reckoning long overdue? The questions swirled in his mind, leaving him more confused than ever. Eventually, David got up and wandered into the living room, where Sarah was flipping through channels on the TV. She glanced at him briefly before turning her attention back to the screen. "How was it today?" she asked, her voice flat. David hesitated, unsure how to answer. "Same as yesterday," he muttered, sinking onto the couch beside her. Sarah nodded, her expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, she broke the silence. "You know," she said softly, maybe this isn't about the medal." David frowned, turning to look at her. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice tinged with frustration. Sarah sighed, setting the remote down on the coffee table. "I mean, maybe the medal gave you confidence because it reminded you of who you are. But now that it's gone, you're realizing that confidence has to come from somewhere deeper, from you, not from a piece of metal." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut, forcing him to confront a truth he'd been avoiding. The medal hadn't made him brave or honorable. It had simply been a symbol of qualities he already possessed, or at least used to possess. That night, David lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Sarah's words echoed in his mind, refusing to let him sleep. Was she right? Had he become too reliant on the metal, using it as a crutch to prop up his self-worth? The thought scared him, not because it was untrue, but because it meant he had work to do, real, honest work, to rebuild himself from the ground up. Without the medal, without the titles or accolades, who was he? What did he stand for? The next day, David returned to the courtroom with a newfound determination. He didn't know if it would make a difference, but he owed it to himself, and to those who had once believed in him, to try. As he took his seat at the witness stand, he noticed the medal still sitting on the judge's desk, just as it had been for days. This time, though, he didn't let it distract him. Instead, he focused on the task at hand, telling the truth as best as he could, and standing by the choices he had made, flawed though they might have been. The opposing lawyer wasted no time launching into another round of aggressive questioning. "Let's revisit the incident with the civilians," he said, leaning forward slightly. "Would you say your actions directly endangered their lives?" David took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I won't deny that my decisions carried risks," he began, his voice firmer than it had been in days. "But I acted with the information I had at the time. If I had to do it again, knowing what I knew then, I wouldn't change a thing." The lawyer raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the sudden shift in David's demeanor. For the first time, David didn't shrink under the pressure. He met the lawyer's gaze head-on, refusing to back down. As the day wore on, David continued to hold his ground. His answers were still imperfect, still vulnerable to interpretation, but they came from a place of honesty and conviction. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to feel a glimmer of hope. Maybe the medal wasn't as important as he'd thought. Maybe, just maybe, he could find strength within himself to face whatever came next. The courtroom felt different that afternoon. The air was still tense, but something subtle had shifted. David could feel it, not in the way the opposing lawyer attacked him, which remained as relentless as ever, but in the way he responded. For the first time in days, his voice didn't waver when he spoke. His answers were clearer, more deliberate, and though they weren't perfect, they carried a weight of sincerity that hadn't been there before. He wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was standing up for the choices he'd made, flaws and all. The opposing lawyer noticed the change too. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it threw him off balance. "You seem very confident now," the lawyer remarked, his tone laced with sarcasm. "What's changed? Yesterday you couldn't even finish your sentences." David hesitated for a moment, considering how to respond. Then he looked directly at the jury, ignoring the lawyer entirely. "I spent some time thinking about what matters most," he said simply. "And I realized that my actions, good or bad, weren't defined by a piece of metal. They were defined by me." The room fell silent. Even the spectators, who had grown restless during previous sessions, leaned forward slightly, intrigued by this unexpected turn. The jury members exchanged glances, their expressions softer than they had been earlier. One older man nodded almost imperceptibly, his brow furrowed in thought. Another juror, the middle-aged woman with glasses, stopped scribbling on her notepad and looked up at David, her skepticism giving way to curiosity. For the first time since the trial began, David felt like he might be getting through to them. But the opposing lawyer wasn't about to let him off the hook. Sensing weakness in David's newfound resolve, he doubled down, pulling out another document. "Let's talk about this report," he said, holding it up for everyone to see. "It claims that your decision-making led to unnecessary delays during a critical operation. Care to comment?" David took a deep breath, steadying himself. This was one of the toughest accusations yet, and he knew it would require careful navigation. "Yes, there were delays," he admitted, his voice calm but firm. "But they happened because I chose to prioritize safety over speed. Rushing into situations without proper planning can cost lives. I've seen it happen." The lawyer smirked, clearly unconvinced. "So you're saying slowing things down saved lives?" he shot back, his tone dripping with doubt. David nodded, meeting the lawyer's gaze head-on. That's exactly what I'm saying. Sometimes taking an extra hour or even a day can mean the difference between success and disaster. And yes, it's a risk. But leadership isn't about playing it safe. It's about making tough calls and living with the consequences. For a brief moment, the courtroom seemed frozen in time. The opposing lawyer opened his mouth to counter, but no words came out immediately. David's response had caught him off guard. It was honest, raw, and impossible to dismiss outright. The jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, whispering among themselves. Some nodded slowly, while others scribbled notes furiously. Even the judge, who had remained stoic throughout the trial, raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable but undeniably curious. As the session dragged on, David continued to hold his ground. Each question from the opposing lawyer felt like a test, and though he didn't always have the perfect answer, he never backed down. Instead, he leaned into the discomfort, using it to fuel his determination. By the time the court adjourned for the day, David felt drained but oddly hopeful. For the first time since the trial began, he believed he might actually have a chance, not necessarily of winning, but of being heard. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed him as usual, shouting questions and shoving cameras in his face. Normally, David would have ignored them, retreating into his car as quickly as possible. But today was different. Today, he paused for a moment, turning to address them directly. "I know people have doubts about me," he said, his voice steady, despite the chaos around him. "And I understand why, but I want everyone to know that I stand by my decisions, not because they were easy, but because they were necessary. That's all I'll say for now." With that, he walked away, leaving the reporters stunned into silence. Back home, Sarah greeted him at the door, her eyes wide with surprise. "What was that?" she asked, nodding toward the TV, where news channels were already replaying clips of his impromptu statement. David shrugged, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Just telling the truth," he replied. "No meddle, no excuses, just me." Sarah studied him for a moment, then smiled softly. "I'm proud of you," she said simply, wrapping her arms around him. It was the first time in weeks that she had hugged him, and it felt like coming home. That night, David slept better than he had in days. The heaviness in his chest was still there, but it felt lighter somehow, less suffocating. He dreamed of the medal sitting on the judge's desk, gleaming under the harsh lights. In his dream, he reached for it, but instead of picking it up, he left it there, untouched. When he woke up the next morning, he realized something important. The medal wasn't gone forever. Its absence had forced him to confront parts of himself he'd been avoiding. The insecurities, the doubts, the fear of failure. And in doing so, he had rediscovered a strength he didn't know he still possessed. The fourth day of testimony began much like the others, with the opposing lawyer launching into another round of aggressive questioning. But this time David was ready. He answered each question with clarity and conviction, refusing to let the lawyer rattle him. When asked about past mistakes, he acknowledged them openly, explaining his reasoning without becoming defensive. When MIC, cornered by inconsistencies in his story, he admitted to human error but emphasized the importance of learning from those errors. Slowly but surely, the narrative began to shift, not dramatically, but enough to make a difference. Even the jury seemed to soften slightly. Their expressions were still guarded, but there was a flicker of understanding in their eyes, a recognition that David was more than the sum of his failures. One juror, a young woman who had barely spoken during the trial, leaned forward intently, hanging on every word he said. Another, an older man with weathered hands, nodded approvingly after David explained a particularly difficult decision. These small gestures gave David hope. Not false hope, but the kind rooted in hard-earned progress. By lunchtime, David felt a sense of accomplishment he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was something far more valuable: self-respect. Without the metal to define him, he had been forced to dig deep and find strength within himself. And while the road ahead was still uncertain, he knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened next, he would face it with honesty and courage. Because in the end, that was all anyone could ask of him, and all he could ask of himself. The days that followed felt like a turning point, though David couldn't quite put his finger on why. Maybe it was the way the jury seemed to lean forward just a little more when he spoke, their expressions softer, their pens moving steadily across their notepads. Or maybe it was the fact that for the first time since the trial began, David didn't feel like he was drowning. The heaviness in his chest had lifted slightly, replaced by something else. A quiet determination to see this through, no matter the outcome. On the 5th day of testimony, the opposing lawyer tried a new tactic. Instead of bombarding David with rapid-fire questions, he slowed down, drawing out each word as if savoring the moment. "Let's talk about trust," he said, pacing slowly in front of the witness stand. "You've admitted to making decisions that went against protocol. How can we trust someone who doesn't follow the rules?" It was a loaded question, designed to make David sound reckless or irresponsible, but instead of shrinking under the weight of it, David took a deep breath and answered honestly. "Trust isn't about following rules blindly," he said, his voice steady. "It's about doing what's right even when it's hard. Rules are important, yes, but they're not perfect. Sometimes you have to look at the bigger picture and decide what truly matters." He paused, glancing briefly at the jury before continuing. "I've made mistakes, I won't deny that. But every decision I made was with the best intentions. If I had to do it all over again, knowing what I knew then, I wouldn't change a thing." The courtroom fell silent. Even the opposing lawyer seemed momentarily stunned, his confident stride faltering for just a second. David could feel the tension in the room shifting, the air thick with unspoken thoughts. The jurors exchanged glances, their faces thoughtful, rather than skeptical. One woman nodded almost imperceptibly, her lips pressed into a thin line as she scribbled something in her notebook. Another juror, an older man with graying hair, leaned back in his chair, studying David with a mix of curiosity and respect. Outside the courthouse, reporters continued to swarm, eager for sound bites or dramatic reactions. But David had changed too. He no longer avoided them, ducking into his car with his head down. Instead, he walked past them with his shoulders squared, meeting their cameras without flinching. When one reporter shouted, "Do you think you'll win this case?" David stopped mid-stride and turned to face him. "Winning isn't the point," he said simply. "What matters is telling the truth, not just my truth, but the whole story. That's all anyone can ask for." His words echoed through the crowd, leaving reporters scrambling to write them down. For the first time, David felt like he wasn't just fighting to save his reputation, he was fighting to be understood. And while he knew the odds were still stacked against him, he also knew he had done everything he could to set the record straight. Back home, Sarah waited for him, her expression softer than it had been in weeks. "You're different," she said as he stepped inside, kicking off his shoes and collapsing onto the couch. David chuckled dryly, running a hand through his hair. "Different how?" he asked, half joking. Sarah sat beside him, resting a hand on his knee. "More grounded," she replied after a moment. "Like you've accepted what's happening instead of fighting it so hard." David thought about that as he stared at the ceiling, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. She was right, he had changed. The medal had been a symbol of his achievements, yes, but it had also become a crutch, something he relied on to prove his worth. Without it, he'd been forced to confront his own insecurities, to dig deep and find strength within himself. It hadn't been easy. In fact, it had been one of the hardest things he'd ever done. But it had taught him something valuable, that true confidence came from within, not from external validation. The next morning, David woke up feeling lighter, though the knot of anxiety in his stomach remained. Today was the final day of testimony, and he knew the opposing lawyer would pull out all the stops. As he dressed and prepared to leave, he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror, His face was tired, shadowed by sleepless nights and endless stress, but there was something new in his eyes, a glimmer of resolve, of quiet courage. He nodded at his reflection, a silent promise to himself to stay strong no matter what happened. When he arrived at the courthouse, the atmosphere was electric. Reporters lined the steps, shouting questions and jostling for position. Inside, the gallery was packed, every seat filled with spectators eager to see how the trial would conclude. David took his place at the witness stand, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. The opposing lawyer approached, his demeanor calm but calculating. "Let's finish this," he said, his tone clipped. "One last question. Do you believe your actions, your mistakes, justify the consequences you're facing today?" David hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on him. This was it, the moment he had been dreading and preparing for all along. He glanced at the jury, then at the judge, before finally looking directly at the lawyer. "Consequences are part of life," he said, his voice firm. "We all make choices, and those choices have outcomes. Some are good, some are bad. But running away from them or pretending they don't exist isn't the answer. Facing them head on, learning from them, and growing stronger because of them, that's what matters." The courtroom erupted into murmurs, the audience buzzing with whispered reactions. The opposing lawyer opened his mouth to respond but closed it again, seemingly unsure how to counter such a straightforward answer. Even the judge raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable but undeniably intrigued. David felt a surge of relief wash over him, not because he thought he'd won, but because he knew he'd given it his all. As the session ended and the jury was dismissed to deliberate, David stepped outside, breathing in the cool afternoon air. Reporters surrounded him immediately, their cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward, but instead of feeling overwhelmed, David found himself smiling faintly. "Thank you," he said, addressing the crowd, "for listening, for caring. Whatever happens next, I hope you know I gave you the truth, the whole truth and nothing less." The reporters fell silent for a moment, taken aback by his sincerity. Then slowly they began to clap, not loudly, but enough to fill the space, with a sense of mutual respect. David nodded in acknowledgement before walking away, his heart heavy but hopeful. He didn't know what the jury's verdict would be, but he did know one thing. He had faced the toughest challenge of his life without flinching, and that more than anything was a victory in itself. The waiting was the hardest part. After the jury disappeared behind closed doors to deliberate, David sat alone in a small room adjacent to the courtroom, his mind racing with possibilities. He replayed every moment of his testimony, the questions, the answers, the pauses that felt like hours, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't predict what the verdict would be. Would they see him as honest and flawed, but ultimately decent? Or would they side with the opposing lawyer, viewing him as reckless and untrustworthy? The uncertainty gnawed at him, making the minutes stretch into what felt like days. Sarah arrived halfway through the wait, bringing coffee and a quiet presence that calmed David more than words ever could. She didn't ask if he thought he'd win or lose. Instead, she simply sat beside him, holding his hand tightly. "You've done all you can," she said softly after a while. "No matter what happens, I'm proud of you." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, and David squeezed her hand in response. For the first time since the trial began, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he had already won something far greater than a legal victory: the respect of those who mattered most. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, a court officer appeared in the doorway. "They're ready," he announced, his tone neutral. David's heart skipped a beat as he stood up, his legs feeling shaky beneath him. He followed the officer back into the courtroom, where the gallery was packed once again. Reporters jostled for position, their cameras clicking furiously. The jury filed in silently, their faces unreadable masks. David searched their expressions for clues, a flicker of sympathy, a hint of judgment, but found nothing. They were professionals, trained to keep their thoughts hidden until the very end. The foreman stood, his hands trembling slightly, as he held a folded piece of paper. The judge nodded at him, signaling for him to proceed. On the charges presented, the foreman began, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. We find the defendant. He paused, glancing down at the paper one last time before looking directly at David. Not guilty. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. David blinked, certain he had misheard. Not guilty? The words echoed in his mind, bouncing off the walls of disbelief that had built up over weeks of grueling testimony. Then, slowly, reality sank in. A wave of relief crashed over him, so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. His vision blurred with tears he hadn't realized he'd been holding back, and he reached out instinctively for Sarah's hand. She gripped it tightly, her own eyes shining with emotion. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, some celebratory, others disappointed. Reporters scrambled to file their stories, shouting questions at David even as the judge called for order. But none of it registered fully. All David could focus on was the overwhelming sense of vindication washing over him. He hadn't just survived this trial. He had proven to himself and others that he was more than the sum of his mistakes. Without the medal to prop him up, he had faced scrutiny head-on and emerged stronger because of it. Outside the courthouse, the scene was chaotic. Cameras flashed, microphones were shoved in his face, and strangers cheered as though they had known him personally. David smiled faintly, raising a hand to acknowledge the crowd. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice carrying just enough to be heard over the noise. "This isn't about me. It's about truth and accountability. And today, justice was served." But as the initial excitement faded, reality began to set in. David knew the verdict didn't erase the damage done to his reputation. Friends and colleagues who had distanced themselves during the trial wouldn't magically reappear overnight. The headlines questioning his integrity would linger online forever, haunting future searches of his name. Even worse, he understood now that the career he had worked so hard to build might never fully recover. Employers would hesitate to hire someone whose past had been dragged through public scrutiny, no matter how favorable the outcome. Months passed and life settled into a new kind of normal. David applied for jobs within his field, hoping to rebuild his professional identity. But rejection letters piled up faster than he could count. Each one stung, reopening wounds he thought had begun to heal. Eventually, he stopped applying altogether, accepting that doors once open to him were now firmly shut. Instead, he took odd jobs, deliveries, manual labor, anything to make ends meet. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and for the first time in years, David found solace in simplicity. He spent his evenings reading or taking long walks around the neighborhood, observing the quiet beauty of everyday life. Children played on sidewalks, couples walked hand in hand under streetlights, and neighbors exchanged friendly waves. These moments reminded David of something important. There was value in ordinary existence, in finding joy in the little things. Stripped of titles and accolades, he learned to appreciate the person he was becoming, not the decorated figurehead others had seen him as, but a flawed, resilient human being trying to navigate the complexities of life. One evening, sitting on a park bench watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink, David reflected on everything he had been through. The medal still sat untouched in a drawer somewhere, gathering dust. Its absence had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself, to rediscover strength he didn't know he possessed. While he missed the pride and purpose that came with his former life, he gained something else: clarity. Life hadn't turned out the way he planned, but perhaps that was okay. He learned to value quiet moments, simple joys, and the courage found in vulnerability. As darkness fell and the stars began to twinkle overhead, David smiled softly to himself. Redemption wasn't about erasing the past or undoing mistakes. It was about learning from them, growing stronger and moving forward with grace. He didn't have all the answers, and the road ahead was still uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew he could face them, not because of a medal or a title, but because of the man he had become.